Welcome, sailor. This is the story of a veteran fishing captain who thought he'd seen it all, until a sudden hull breach sent his best friend to the bottom in minutes. What started as a routine salmon run off the Oregon coast became a brutal fight for survival and a haunting reminder of how fast the sea can take everything.
My name is David Martinez, and for 23 years I've been fishing the waters off the Oregon coast with my best friend and business partner, Marcus Thompson. We'd weathered storms that sank other boats, survived equipment failures that would have killed less experienced crews, and built a successful fishing operation that supported both our families. But nothing in 2 decades of partnership prepared me for September 14th, when I watched Marcus disappear beneath the waves with our boat, and learned that sometimes experience isn't enough to save the people you love most. The morning started like hundreds of others aboard the Maria Elena, our 38-foot salmon trawler that had been our livelihood for the past 8 years. Marcus and I had been fishing partners since we were 19, starting with small day boats and working our way up to the point where we owned our own vessel and fishing operation. Marcus Thompson was more than my business partner, he was my brother in every way that mattered. We'd grown up in the same neighborhood in Astoria, learned to fish from the same old-timers, and built our lives around the rhythms of the commercial fishing season. His wife Sarah and my wife Carmen were best friends, and our kids had grown up thinking of each other as cousins. The Maria Elena was named after my grandmother, and she represented everything Marcus and I had worked for over 2 decades of fishing together. She was a solid boat with reliable engines, modern electronics, and all the safety equipment required for offshore commercial fishing. We'd maintained her meticulously because our lives and livelihoods depended on her seaworthiness. We left Newport at 4:30 a.m. on September 14th, heading for our usual fishing grounds about 18 miles offshore where the fall salmon runs were just beginning. The weather forecast called for moderate conditions. Northwest winds 10 to 15 knots, seas 3 to 5 feet. Perfect conditions for trolling operations. Coffee's ready, Marcus called from the galley as we cleared the harbor entrance. And Sarah packed those cookies you like. It was the kind of casual morning conversation we'd shared thousands of times over the years. Marcus handled the galley duties while I managed navigation and engine operations, a division of labor that had evolved naturally through 2 decades of working together. The run to our fishing grounds took about 90 minutes, during which we discussed our game plan for the day. The salmon runs had been good this season, and we were hoping to fill our fish holds before the weather turned rough later in the week. Electronics are showing good fish marks, Marcus reported as we approached our target area. Looks like they're holding at about 60 feet. I began deploying our trolling gear while Marcus monitored the fish finder and managed our course. We worked with the coordination that comes from years of partnership, each of us knowing what the other would do before the action was completed. By 8 a.m., we had 4 lines in the water and were beginning our first trolling pass over the area where our electronics showed the highest concentration of fish. The Maria Elena was running smoothly at trolling speed, and everything indicated we were in for a productive day. The first sign of trouble came at 9:23 a.m., when I noticed a slight vibration in the boat's motion that wasn't consistent with normal engine operation or wave action. "Marcus, you feel that?" I called from the wheelhouse. "Feel what?" he replied, focused on adjusting one of our downrigger lines. The vibration was subtle but persistent, like something was out of balance in the boat's systems. I reduced engine RPM slightly and checked our gauges, but everything appeared normal. Oil pressure good, engine temperature normal, electrical systems functioning properly. Probably just hit some debris, I decided, returning to our normal trolling speed. But the vibration continued, and over the next 20 minutes it seemed to be getting worse. I began to suspect we might have damaged our propeller or picked up something on the prop that was causing imbalance. At 9:47 a.m., the vibration suddenly stopped. "That's better," Marcus said, noticing the smoother motion. Whatever it was must have worked itself loose. But the sudden cessation of the vibration worried me more than the vibration itself had. In my experience, mechanical problems don't usually resolve themselves. They either get worse or they indicate that something has failed completely. I decided to check the engine compartment to make sure everything was functioning normally. What I found there changed our routine fishing trip into a life-or-death emergency. "Marcus, get up here right now," I shouted from the engine compartment. "We've got water coming in." The bilge was filling with seawater at a rate that indicated a serious hull breach somewhere below the waterline. The automatic bilge pump was running continuously but wasn't keeping up with the inflow, and I could see the water level rising steadily. Marcus appeared at the engine compartment hatch within seconds, taking in the situation with the quick assessment skills that had made him such a reliable partner. "How bad?" he asked, already moving toward the manual bilge pump controls. Bad, I replied, trying to locate the source of the leak. We're taking on water faster than the pumps can handle. We had practiced emergency procedures hundreds of times, but actually experiencing a hull breach in 18 miles of open ocean was different from theoretical preparation. The water was coming in through what appeared to be a split seam in the hull plating, probably caused by metal fatigue that had finally reached the failure point. I'm starting the high-capacity pump, Marcus called out, activating our emergency bilge system. Can you find where it's coming in? The leak was located in an area that was difficult to access and impossible to repair while the boat was in the water. The hull plating had separated along a seam that ran for several feet below the waterline, creating an opening that was letting in hundreds of gallons of seawater per minute. It's the starboard hull seam, I reported. At least 3 feet of separation. We can't fix this at sea. Marcus began transmitting our mayday call while I continued trying to slow the water ingress using emergency patching materials. But it was becoming clear that our efforts weren't sufficient to keep the Maria Elena afloat much longer. Mayday, 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 Marcus transmitted on channel 16. This is fishing vessel Maria Elena. We have catastrophic hull failure and are taking on water rapidly. Position 44 degrees 32 minutes north, 124 degrees 18 minutes west. Our position put us 18 miles from the nearest shore and 12 miles from the nearest commercial fishing vessel according to our radar. The Coast Guard response was immediate and professional, but their estimated arrival time was 45 minutes under optimal conditions. Roger, Maria Elena, the Coast Guard responded. We have your position and are dispatching rescue assets. Can you maintain buoyancy? I looked at the rising water in our engine compartment and made the calculation that every commercial fisherman dreads. The Maria Elena was sinking, and she was sinking faster than help could reach us. Negative on maintaining buoyancy, I radioed. We're preparing to abandon ship. At 10:15 a.m., less than an hour after we'd first noticed the vibration that indicated our hull was failing, we began preparing to abandon the Maria Elena. The boat that had been our home and livelihood for 8 years was going to the bottom, and we had maybe 15 minutes to get off her before she took us with her. Life rafts ready, Marcus reported, preparing our 6-man inflatable raft for deployment. Survival suits are in the wheelhouse. But as we prepared to abandon ship, the Maria Elena's death throes accelerated beyond our worst-case estimates. The hull breach was widening as the boat's structure gave way under the stress of flooding, and she was settling by the bow much faster than we'd anticipated. At 10:18 a.m., the Maria Elena suddenly lurched forward and began going down by the bow. She's going now, I shouted. Get the raft deployed. Marcus was in the process of deploying our life raft when the boat's angle became too steep for him to maintain his footing. He slipped on the wet deck and fell toward the stern, grabbing onto the rail but unable to get back to his feet as the boat continued to sink. Dave, help me, he called out, but I was trapped in the wheelhouse by the boat's extreme angle, unable to reach him without falling into the ocean myself. The Maria Elena was going down bow first, and Marcus was at the stern end of a boat that was rapidly becoming vertical in the water. I could see him struggling to maintain his grip on the rail as the boat's death dive accelerated. Jump clear, I shouted. Get away from the boat. But Marcus was tangled in the life raft deployment lines, unable to free himself as the Maria Elena began her final plunge toward the bottom. I watched in horror as my best friend and partner of 23 years disappeared beneath the surface, still connected to the boat that was dragging him down. The Maria Elena sank in less than 3 minutes from the time she began her final dive. One moment she was a fishing boat with 2 men aboard, and the next she was gone, leaving me floating alone in my survival suit with an inflatable life raft and the knowledge that Marcus was somewhere beneath me, probably already dead. I had survived the sinking, but I had lost my best friend, my business partner, and the only life I'd known for over 2 decades. The Pacific Ocean had taken everything from me in 3 minutes, and there was nothing I could have done to change the outcome. As I floated alone in the life raft, waiting for Coast Guard rescue, I began the process of trying to understand how 23 years of partnership and friendship had ended with me watching Marcus sink with our boat, helpless to save him. The Coast Guard helicopter found me 47 minutes after the Maria Elena went down, floating in our life raft 18 miles from shore with nothing but survival gear and the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. The rescue was textbook professional, fast, efficient, and conducted by people who understood that every minute in the water increased the risk of hypothermia and shock. Are you injured? The rescue swimmer asked as he helped me into the helicopter's rescue basket. No physical injuries, I replied, though I felt like everything inside me had been broken when I watched Marcus disappear with our boat. During the flight back to shore, the Coast Guard crew asked the standard questions about the sinking. Time of hull failure, location of the breach, sequence of events leading to abandonment. I answered mechanically, my mind still trapped in those final moments when Marcus had been struggling with the life raft lines as the Maria Elena went vertical. Was there anyone else aboard? The crew chief asked. My partner, I said. Marcus Thompson. He went down with the boat. The words felt unreal as I spoke them. After 23 years of working together, sharing dangers and successes, building our lives around our partnership, Marcus was gone. Drowned in 300 feet of water with the boat that had been our shared dream. The Coast Guard continued search operations for the next 18 hours, using helicopters, cutters, and civilian vessels to comb the area where the Maria Elena had sunk. They found debris from our boat, life preservers, fishing gear, pieces of the wheelhouse that had broken free during the sinking, but no sign of Marcus. We're calling off active search operations, the Coast Guard commander told me during the debriefing. Given the water temperature and time elapsed, survival probability is essentially zero. I knew he was right. Water temperature in September off the Oregon coast was about 55 degrees, cold enough to cause hypothermia in less than an hour for someone without proper protection. Marcus had been wearing work clothes, not a survival suit, when he went down with the boat. But knowing he was dead and accepting it were different things. For 23 years, Marcus and I had gotten each other out of dangerous situations through skill, luck, and mutual support. The idea that I'd survived while he died violated everything I understood about how our partnership worked. The preliminary Coast Guard investigation concluded that the Maria Elena had suffered catastrophic hull failure due to metal fatigue, probably accelerated by the stress of years of commercial fishing operations. The hull breach had been sudden and extensive, giving us insufficient time to implement effective damage control procedures. This wasn't preventable with the equipment and knowledge available to you, the investigating officer explained. Hull failures of this type are rare but not unknown in vessels of this age and usage pattern. The technical explanation didn't help with the emotional reality of what had happened. I'd been the captain responsible for the boat and crew safety. Marcus had died on my watch, and no amount of rational analysis could change the fact that I'd failed to save my best friend's life. 2 days after the sinking, I had to face the hardest conversation of my life, telling Sarah Thompson that her husband wasn't coming home. Sarah had been expecting us back from our fishing trip on September 15th. When we didn't return on schedule, she'd assumed we'd stayed out an extra day to take advantage of good fishing conditions. It wasn't until the Coast Guard contacted her that she learned about the sinking. "Where is he?" she asked when I arrived at her house, still hoping against all evidence that Marcus had somehow survived. "He went down with the boat," I told her, the words feeling like broken glass in my throat. I couldn't get to him in time. I couldn't save him. Sarah's reaction was a mixture of grief, shock, and the terrible practical realities that face fishing families when boats don't come home. She had 2 children to raise, a mortgage on a house that had been purchased with fishing income, and no idea how she was going to manage without Marcus's earnings. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, not really expecting an answer to an impossible question. I didn't have an answer. The Maria Elena had been uninsured beyond basic liability coverage because comprehensive marine insurance was too expensive for a small fishing operation. Marcus's life insurance would provide some support for his family, but not enough to replace the income from our fishing business. My own situation was almost as difficult. The boat that had been my livelihood was gone, along with all the fishing gear, electronics, and equipment that represented 23 years of investment in our business. I had some savings, but not enough to buy another boat or start over in commercial fishing at age 42. But the financial problems were secondary to the psychological trauma of losing Marcus in such a sudden, violent way. We'd been best friends since childhood, business partners for over 2 decades, and closer than many blood brothers. His death left a hole in my life that couldn't be filled by insurance settlements or new business opportunities. 3 weeks after the sinking, I attended Marcus's memorial service at the Methodist Church where both our families had been members for years. The service was well attended by the fishing community, friends, and family members who had known Marcus as a generous, hard-working man who loved his family and took pride in his work. But I sat in that church feeling like a fraud. I was the survivor, the one who'd made it off the sinking boat while Marcus drowned. In the unforgiving arithmetic of maritime disasters, I'd lived while my best friend died, and I couldn't explain why that felt like a betrayal of our 23-year partnership. During the reception after the service, people offered condolences and shared memories of Marcus. But their words felt hollow to me, filtered through the guilt of survival and the knowledge that I'd been unable to save the person who mattered most. It wasn't your fault, Carmen told me that evening as we sat in our kitchen, surrounded by casserole dishes and flowers from people who were trying to help us process our loss. You did everything you could. But I kept replaying those final moments. Marcus struggling with the life raft lines, the boat going vertical, my inability to reach him before the Maria Elena began her death dive. In my mind, there had to have been something I could have done differently, some action that would have saved his life. I should have made him put on a survival suit, I said. I should have deployed the raft sooner. I should have stayed closer to him when the boat started going down. Carmen had heard these self-recriminations every day since the sinking, and she was running out of ways to counter them. The truth was that maritime accidents happen fast, decisions have to be made with incomplete information, and sometimes good people die despite everyone's best efforts to save them. But understanding the reality of maritime emergencies intellectually didn't ease the emotional burden of watching your best friend sink with the boat while you escaped to safety. A month after the sinking, I received the final Coast Guard incident report. The investigation had determined that the hull failure was due to a combination of metal fatigue and corrosion that had developed over years of normal fishing operations. The failure pattern suggested that the breach had propagated rapidly once it began, giving us minimal time to respond. The crew's response to the emergency was appropriate and professional, the report concluded. The loss of life was due to the rapid sinking of the vessel, not to any failure of emergency procedures or equipment. The official vindication meant nothing to me. Marcus was still dead, his family was still struggling financially, and I was still haunted by the image of him disappearing beneath the waves while I floated to safety in a survival suit. 6 weeks after the sinking, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I was done with commercial fishing. I couldn't imagine working another boat without Marcus, couldn't face the daily reminders of what we'd lost, and couldn't trust myself to keep other people safe when I'd failed to save my best friend. What are you going to do? Carmen asked when I told her about my decision to leave fishing. I don't know, I admitted, but I can't go back out there. Not without Marcus. The end of my fishing career meant the end of the only adult life I'd ever known. Commercial fishing had been my identity, my livelihood, and my connection to a community that stretched back generations. But it was also connected to the worst day of my life, when I'd watched my best friend sink with our boat and learned that sometimes being a survivor is its own kind of punishment. 6 months after the sinking, I was working construction in Portland, trying to build a new life around the hole that Marcus's death had left in everything I thought I understood about friendship, partnership, and survival. The work was steady but unfulfilling, a way to pay bills rather than a calling that gave meaning to my days. Every morning I woke up with the same thought: Marcus should be here. We should be planning our fishing season, discussing boat repairs, arguing about the best fishing grounds for spring salmon. Instead, I was framing houses for people I'd never meet, trying to forget that I'd once had a different life. The construction crew I worked with knew about my background. In a place like Portland, word travels fast about local fishermen who lose their boats. But they also knew not to ask too many questions about why someone gives up 23 years of commercial fishing to pound nails for a living. You ever think about going back to fishing? My foreman asked during one of our coffee breaks. Every day, I replied honestly. But thinking about it and being able to do it are different things. The truth was that I'd tried to return to fishing twice in the months after Marcus's death. Both times, I'd made it as far as the harbor before panic attacks forced me to turn around and drive home. Being near boats, smelling the salt air, hearing the sounds of engines and rigging, it all brought back the memory of watching Marcus disappear beneath the waves. Carmen was worried about my psychological state, though she tried not to show it. I'd gone from being an outgoing person who loved his work to someone who came home exhausted every day and spent evenings staring at the television without really watching it. Maybe you should talk to someone, she suggested gently. A counselor or therapist who works with people who've been through trauma. The idea of therapy seemed foreign to me. Commercial fishermen dealt with dangerous situations and tragic losses as part of the job. We supported each other through informal networks of shared experience and mutual understanding, not through professional counseling sessions. But as the first anniversary of Marcus's death approached, I realized that my informal coping mechanisms weren't working. The guilt, the recurring nightmares, and the inability to return to the work I'd loved were symptoms of trauma that needed professional treatment. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a therapist who specialized in survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress related to workplace accidents. Her office was in downtown Portland, a world away from the fishing docks where I'd spent most of my adult life. "Tell me about your relationship with Marcus," she said during our first session. For the next hour, I talked about 23 years of friendship and partnership. I described how we'd learned to fish together, built our business from nothing, shared the risks and rewards of commercial fishing, and developed the kind of trust that only comes from years of depending on each other in dangerous situations. It sounds like losing Marcus was like losing a part of yourself, Dr. Martinez observed. He was my partner in everything, I replied. We made decisions together, shared responsibilities, watched each other's backs. When he died, it felt like half of who I was went down with the boat. Dr. Martinez explained that survivor's guilt was a common response to traumatic losses, especially in high-risk occupations where people depend on each other for survival. The fact that I'd lived while Marcus died created a psychological burden that was compounded by my sense of responsibility as the boat's captain. But you said the Coast Guard investigation found that the sinking wasn't preventable, she pointed out. That your response to the emergency was appropriate and professional. That doesn't change the fact that Marcus is dead and I'm alive, I replied. It doesn't change the fact that I couldn't save him. Over the next several months, therapy helped me understand that my guilt was a normal response to an abnormal situation. Marcus's death had been a tragedy, but it hadn't been caused by my failure as a captain or partner. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, maritime emergencies end with good people dying. But understanding the psychology of survivor's guilt didn't immediately cure it. I still woke up thinking about Marcus, still felt responsible for his death, and still couldn't imagine returning to commercial fishing without him. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Captain Jim Wilson, a veteran fisherman who'd known both Marcus and me since we were young men learning the trade. Jim had stopped by the construction site where I was working, ostensibly to discuss a boat repair project but really to check on how I was coping with my loss. Marcus wouldn't want you to quit fishing, Jim said during our conversation. He'd want you to keep doing the work you both loved. I can't do it without him, I replied. We were a team. I don't know how to fish alone. You won't be alone, Jim said. There are plenty of experienced fishermen who'd be honored to work with someone with your skills and reputation. Marcus taught you everything he knew, and that knowledge shouldn't die with him. Jim's words forced me to consider something I'd been avoiding, the possibility that honoring Marcus's memory might mean returning to fishing rather than abandoning it. Everything I knew about commercial fishing, I'd learned with Marcus as my partner. Walking away from that knowledge felt like letting his death diminish not just my life, but his legacy as well. 8 months after Marcus's death, I took the first step toward returning to fishing. I contacted the owner of a 42-foot salmon trawler who was looking for an experienced captain to run his boat during the upcoming season. I heard about what happened to you and Marcus, the owner said when we met. That was a hell of a thing. But I've also heard you're one of the best fishermen on this coast, and I'd be proud to have you run my boat. The conversation felt surreal. 4 months, I'd been David Martinez, construction worker and trauma survivor. Now someone was asking me to be Captain Martinez again, to return to the identity I'd abandoned after watching my best friend sink with our boat. I need to be honest with you, I told the boat owner. I haven't been fishing since the accident. I don't know if I can handle being back on the water. Only one way to find out, he replied. Take her out for a day trip. See how it feels. The test trip was scheduled for a calm morning in early spring, perfect conditions for someone returning to fishing after a traumatic experience. I brought Carmen with me for emotional support, along with Jim Wilson and 2 other experienced fishermen who understood what I was trying to accomplish. Walking down the dock toward the boat, I felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that had preceded every fishing trip for over 2 decades. But this time, the anxiety was overlaid with grief for the partner who wouldn't be making this trip with me. You okay? Carmen asked as we prepared to cast off. I will be, I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. The first few hours on the water were difficult. Every routine task, checking engine parameters, deploying fishing gear, monitoring electronics, reminded me of how Marcus and I had divided these responsibilities. I kept expecting to hear his voice from the galley or see him adjusting our downrigger lines. But gradually, as the day progressed, I began to remember why I'd fallen in love with commercial fishing in the first place. The challenge of reading water conditions, the satisfaction of landing fish, the connection to natural cycles that stretched back generations. All of it was still there, waiting for me to rediscover it. How does it feel? Jim asked during our lunch break. Different, I replied honestly, but not wrong. Marcus would want me to be out here. By the end of the day, I knew that I could return to fishing. It would be different without Marcus, and there would always be a part of me that missed having him as a partner. But abandoning fishing entirely would be a betrayal of everything we'd built together over 23 years. That evening, I called the boat owner and accepted his offer to captain his vessel for the upcoming salmon season. It was the first step toward rebuilding my life around the work I loved, while carrying the memory of my lost partner with me every day. The decision to return to fishing didn't cure my survivor's guilt or eliminate the trauma of watching Marcus die, but it gave me a way to honor his memory while continuing the work that had defined both our lives. Sometimes the best way to deal with loss is not to escape from it, but to carry it with you as you move forward. My first day as captain of the North Star began before dawn on April 15th, exactly 7 months after I'd watched Marcus sink with the Maria Elena. As I walked down the dock toward my new boat, every step felt like a choice between honoring my partner's memory and betraying my own survival. The North Star was a well-maintained 42-foot salmon trawler, similar in size and design to the boat Marcus and I had owned. Her owner, Robert Kim, had bought her as an investment property and hired experienced captains to run her during fishing season. For him, she was a business asset. For me, she was a chance to return to the only work I'd ever truly loved. My crew for the season consisted of 2 experienced fishermen, Tony Ramos, a 34-year-old Mexican-American who'd been fishing these waters for over a decade, and Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old who reminded me of myself at that age, eager, hardworking, and still learning the subtleties of commercial fishing. "Captain Martinez," Tony said as I boarded the North Star. "It's an honor to be working with you. I heard a lot about you and Marcus over the years." The mention of Marcus's name hit harder than I'd expected. After months of avoiding the fishing community, I'd forgotten how closely our reputations had been linked, how other fishermen thought of us as a unit rather than as separate individuals. "Marcus was the better fisherman," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just learned from the best." But as we prepared the North Star for our first fishing trip, I realized that my partnership with Marcus had taught me more than I'd consciously understood. The way I organized gear, checked safety equipment, and planned our route to the fishing grounds all reflected lessons learned during 23 years of working with someone whose judgment I trusted completely. "Where are we heading today?" Jake asked as we cleared Newport Harbor. 17 miles northwest, I replied, providing coordinates for fishing grounds that Marcus and I had worked successfully for years. The spring salmon should be starting their run through that area. The navigation to our fishing grounds gave me time to re-establish my relationship with being on the water. The familiar motion of the boat, the sound of diesel engines, the smell of salt air, all of it brought back memories of thousands of mornings when Marcus and I had made this same journey together. But I also noticed differences that reminded me I was now working alone, without the partner who'd shared both the decisions and the responsibilities of commercial fishing. Every choice about where to fish, how to deploy our gear, and when to move to different areas was now mine alone to make. "Fish finders showing good marks," Tony reported as we approached our target area. "Looks like they're holding at about 40 feet. I began the process of deploying our trolling gear, movements that had become automatic through decades of repetition. But working with a new crew meant explaining procedures that Marcus and I had never needed to discuss, verbalizing knowledge that had been shared through wordless understanding. "We'll run 4 lines, I told Jake as he prepared the downrigger equipment. 2 on each side, staggered depths. Tony, you monitor the fish finder and call out any changes in bottom structure or fish concentrations." The crew was competent and eager to learn, but they weren't Marcus. They didn't anticipate my next move, didn't share the accumulated knowledge of where fish were likely to be found under specific conditions, and didn't provide the psychological support that comes from working with someone who knows you as well as you know yourself. By mid-morning, we'd caught our first salmon of the season, a beautiful spring Chinook that fought hard before coming to the boat. The success felt good, but it was tinged with sadness for the partner who wasn't there to share it. "Nice fish," Tony said as we prepared the salmon for the ice hold. "This is going to be a good season." I hoped he was right, but I also knew that success in commercial fishing depends on more than just catching fish. It requires the kind of partnership and shared decision-making that Marcus and I had developed over 2 decades, qualities that couldn't be easily replicated with a new crew. Over the next several hours, we continued to work the area, adjusting our depths and lure selections based on what the fish were telling us. The North Star was a good boat with modern equipment, and the crew was learning quickly, but I found myself making decisions that Marcus and I would have discussed and debated. "Should we move to the deeper water?" Jake asked during a slow period in our fishing. "What do you think?" I replied, realizing that I was unconsciously trying to recreate the collaborative decision-making that had characterized my partnership with Marcus. "I think we should stay here for another hour," Jake said. "The tide change might bring more fish through this area." It was exactly the kind of analysis that Marcus would have offered, and it reminded me that good fishermen develop similar instincts regardless of who they learned from. Jake might not be Marcus, but he had the same ability to read water conditions and fish behavior that made the difference between successful and unsuccessful fishing trips. As the day progressed, I began to understand that returning to fishing didn't mean trying to recreate what Marcus and I had shared. It meant building something new while carrying the lessons and memories of our partnership into whatever came next. "Captain, we've got company," Tony called out, pointing toward a boat that was approaching our fishing area. The approaching vessel was the Sea Hawk, captained by Bill Thompson, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname. Bill had been fishing these waters for over 30 years and had known both Marcus and me since we were young men learning the trade. "Dave Martinez," Bill called over the radio. "Good to see you back on the water." "Good to be back," I replied, though the truth was more complicated than that simple statement suggested. "Marcus would be proud," Bill added, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice despite the limitations of radio communication. The exchange was brief, but it reminded me that the fishing community had been watching my struggle to return to the water. Other captains understood what Marcus had meant to me, and they respected the difficulty of continuing without him. As we headed back to port at the end of our first day, I reflected on what I'd learned about fishing without Marcus. It was different, more solitary, more demanding of individual decision-making, and tinged with sadness for what had been lost. But it was also still the work I loved, and it connected me to the memory of my partner in ways that avoiding fishing never could. "How did it feel?" Carmen asked when I got home that evening. "Like fishing," I replied. "But also like something I'm going to have to learn how to do all over again." The first day back on the water hadn't cured my survivor's guilt or eliminated the trauma of watching Marcus die. But it had proven that I could return to commercial fishing, that the knowledge and skills we'd developed together hadn't died with him, and that honoring his memory might mean continuing the work we'd both loved rather than abandoning it. Over the next several weeks, I gradually re-established my rhythm as a fishing captain. The crew of the North Star became more coordinated, my decision-making became more confident, and the boat began producing the kind of consistent catches that made commercial fishing profitable. But every successful day on the water was shadowed by the knowledge that Marcus wasn't there to share it. Success felt incomplete without someone who understood its significance, someone who'd been there through all the years of building our skills and reputation. 2 months into the season, we encountered conditions that tested both my ability to captain a boat alone and my psychological recovery from Marcus's death. A late spring storm system brought rough seas and dangerous conditions that required the kind of decision-making that Marcus and I had always shared. "Seas are building to 8 feet, Tony reported as we monitored weather conditions from our fishing grounds. Winds picking up from the southwest. The decision about whether to continue fishing or head for shelter was exactly the kind of call that Marcus and I would have discussed at length, weighing the potential for good fishing against the risks of deteriorating weather. Now the decision was mine alone to make. "We're heading in," I decided, choosing safety over the possibility of a few more fish. "These conditions are going to get worse before they get better." The run back to port in rough seas tested every skill I'd learned during 23 years of commercial fishing. The North Star handled well, but managing the boat in 8-foot seas while coordinating with crew members who were still learning to work together required constant attention and decision-making. "Nice job bringing us through that," Jake said as we tied up at the dock after a challenging trip home. The compliment meant more than he probably realized. It was confirmation that I could still function as a captain, that the skills Marcus and I had developed were still there even without my partner to share the responsibilities. But that night, I dreamed about the sinking again. The same sequence of events. The hull breach, the rapidly rising water, Marcus struggling with the life raft lines as the Maria Elena went vertical. I woke up in a cold sweat, the image of my best friend disappearing beneath the waves as fresh and painful as it had been 7 months earlier. "Another bad dream?" Carmen asked, knowing the signs of my recurring nightmares. "Same one," I replied. "Always the same one." Dr. Martinez had warned me that returning to fishing might trigger more frequent nightmares as my subconscious processed the trauma of being back on the water. The dreams were my mind's way of working through the guilt and fear that Marcus's death had created. "The nightmares will probably continue for a while," she explained during one of our sessions. "But they should become less frequent as you build new positive associations with fishing." The therapy was helping, but progress was slow and uneven. Some days I felt strong and confident about my decision to return to fishing. Other days I questioned whether I was dishonoring Marcus's memory by continuing without him or putting other crew members at risk because of my psychological issues. 3 months into the season, I faced a situation that forced me to confront both my capabilities as a single captain and my lingering trauma from the sinking. We were fishing in the same general area where the Maria Elena had gone down, working productive waters that Marcus and I had fished for years. The location was coincidental. We were following the fish, not deliberately seeking out the site of the tragedy, but being there brought back memories I'd been trying to suppress. "This area looks familiar," Tony commented as we deployed our gear. "Didn't you and Marcus used to fish here regularly?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to focus on current conditions rather than past memories. "It's been productive water for years." But as the day progressed, I found myself thinking about the last time Marcus and I had fished these waters, just 2 weeks before the sinking. We'd had a good day, catching our limit of salmon and discussing plans for upgrading our electronics before the next season. At 2:30 p.m., our fish finder detected what appeared to be a large object on the bottom, about 300 feet down in water that should have been clear of obstructions. "Captain, you need to see this," Jake called from the electronics console. "There's something big down there." I looked at the fish finder display and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean temperature. The object on the bottom was the right size and shape to be a sunken fishing boat, located approximately where the Maria Elena would have settled after her final dive. "Is that a wreck?" Tony asked, studying the sonar image. "Probably," I replied, though I was almost certain it was the remains of my former boat and my partner's grave. The discovery created an emotional crisis that I hadn't anticipated. Part of me wanted to mark the coordinates and arrange for a dive operation to confirm that we'd found the Maria Elena. But part of me couldn't bear the thought of seeing the boat where Marcus had died, lying broken on the ocean floor. "Should we report it to the Coast Guard?" Jake asked. "They might want to investigate." "I'll handle it," I replied, though I wasn't sure what handling it would involve. That evening, I called the Coast Guard office that had conducted the investigation into our sinking. The duty officer confirmed that the wreck we detected was consistent with the Maria Elena's last known position and suggested that a dive operation could provide closure for both the official investigation and the families involved. But when I discussed the possibility with Sarah Thompson, Marcus's widow, her reaction was immediate and definitive. "I don't want divers going down there," she said. "That's where Marcus is buried. Let him rest in peace." Sarah's wishes settled the question. The Maria Elena would remain on the bottom, undisturbed, a metal monument to a partnership that had ended in tragedy. But knowing where she lay gave me a strange sense of closure, a specific place where I could remember Marcus rather than just the abstract knowledge that he was somewhere beneath the waves. Over the remainder of the fishing season, I gradually built a new routine that honored Marcus's memory while allowing me to continue the work we'd both loved. I kept a photo of him in the North Star's wheelhouse, next to our old fishing licenses and permits. Before each trip, I'd silently promise him that I'd fish with the same care and skill he'd taught me. The crew of the North Star became a real team as the season progressed. Tony developed into an excellent fisherman with instincts that reminded me of Marcus in his younger days. Jake proved to be reliable and eager to learn, qualities that Marcus had always valued in new crew members. But more importantly, I learned that I could be a captain without Marcus, that the knowledge and skills we'd developed together could survive his death and continue to be useful for training new fishermen. Every successful trip was both a tribute to his memory and proof that his influence on my life hadn't ended when he went down with our boat. When the fishing season ended in October, I'd proven to myself and the community that I could return to commercial fishing as a single captain. The North Star had produced good catches, the crew had worked safely and efficiently, and I'd managed to honor Marcus's memory while building something new. But I also knew that my relationship with fishing had been permanently changed by watching my best friend sink with our boat. I would never again take for granted the partnerships and friendships that make dangerous work bearable, and I would never forget that sometimes the best fishermen don't make it home. 1 year after the sinking, I stood on the deck of the North Star at dawn, preparing for what would be either my final fishing trip or the beginning of a new chapter in my life as a commercial fisherman. The anniversary of Marcus's death had brought back all the grief and guilt I'd been working to overcome, and I needed to know whether I could continue fishing or whether the trauma would eventually drive me away from the water. The crew for this trip included Tony and Jake, who'd become not just reliable fishermen but trusted friends over the course of our season together. Also joining us was Marcus Thompson Jr., Marcus's 18-year-old son, who'd asked to come on a fishing trip to better understand what his father had loved about commercial fishing. "Thanks for letting me come," Marcus Jr. said as we prepared to leave the harbor. "I've always wondered what it was like out here." Looking at him, I could see so much of his father. The same curiosity about how things worked, the same eagerness to learn, the same natural feel for being on the water. But I also felt the weight of responsibility for keeping him safe, knowing what his death would do to Sarah and how it would compound my own guilt about surviving when Marcus hadn't. Your dad would be proud to see you out here, I told him honestly. But we're going to be extra careful today. The run to our fishing grounds took us through the area where the Maria Elena had sunk exactly 1 year earlier. I'd avoided this specific location since discovering the wreck on the bottom, but today felt like the right time to confront the site where my partnership with Marcus had ended. Is this where it happened? Marcus Jr. asked, somehow sensing the significance of our location. Yeah, I replied, pointing toward the water where his father had disappeared. Right about here. For several minutes, we stood in silence on the deck of the North Star, four fishermen paying respects to someone who died doing the work we all loved. It was a simple memorial, but it felt more meaningful than any formal ceremony could have been. Tell me what happened, Marcus Jr. said quietly. I need to know. So I told him the story I'd avoided sharing with anyone except Carmen and Dr. Martinez. The hull breach, the rising water, the frantic preparations to abandon ship, and those final moments when his father had been tangled in the life raft lines as the boat went vertical. Could you have saved him? He asked, the question that haunted my own thoughts every day. I don't know, I replied honestly. I've asked myself that question 1,000 times and I still don't have an answer. The boat went down so fast and everything happened at once. I couldn't reach him in time. Marcus Jr. nodded, processing the information with a maturity that reminded me of his father at that age. He wouldn't want you to feel guilty about surviving, he said finally. Dad always said that fishing was dangerous, and that good fishermen looked out for each other but couldn't control everything that happened on the water. His words carried more weight than anything Dr. Martinez had said during months of therapy. This was Marcus's son, speaking with his father's wisdom about the realities of commercial fishing and the acceptance of risks that came with the work. Let's fish, I decided, feeling something shift inside me. Your dad would want us to fish. We deployed our gear in water that was loaded with salmon, beginning what would become one of the most successful fishing trips I'd ever experienced. It was as if the ocean was offering compensation for what it had taken, providing abundance to balance the loss. Fish on. Tony called out as the first salmon of the day hit one of our lines. And it's a big one. Over the next several hours, we caught salmon steadily, filling our fish holds with beautiful spring Chinook that fought hard and brought good prices at the dock. Marcus Jr. proved to be a natural fisherman, anticipating what needed to be done and working with the instinctive understanding of water and fish that his father had possessed. You've got your dad's touch, I told him as he landed a particularly nice fish. He'd be proud of the way you're working. But the real healing came during our lunch break, when Marcus Jr. and I talked about his father in ways I hadn't been able to do since the sinking. Instead of focusing on how Marcus had died, we talked about how he'd lived. His love for his family, his pride in his work, his generosity toward other fishermen, and his skill at reading water and finding fish. He always said you were the best partner he could have asked for, Marcus Jr. told me. He used to say that fishing with you was like having a brother who understood everything without having to explain it. Those words broke something loose inside me that had been frozen since the day I'd watched Marcus sink with our boat. For the first time in a year, I cried for my lost friend, not tears of guilt or trauma, but tears of genuine grief for someone I'd loved and would miss for the rest of my life. I miss him too, Marcus Jr. said, putting his hand on my shoulder. But I think he'd want us to keep fishing. It's what he loved and it's how we can remember him. As the afternoon progressed, our success continued. We caught our limit of salmon and then some, experiencing the kind of fishing day that Marcus and I had dreamed about during all our years of partnership. It felt like a gift, a reminder of why we'd fallen in love with commercial fishing in the first place. But more importantly, it felt like closure. I'd brought Marcus's son to the place where his father had died, shared the story of what had happened, and discovered that the water that had taken my partner could also provide healing and continuation. This has been the best day, Marcus Jr. said as we headed back to port with our catch. I understand now why Dad loved this so much. Are you thinking about becoming a fisherman? I asked. Maybe, he replied. Would you teach me? The way you and Dad learned together? The offer was both an honor and a responsibility that I hadn't expected. Taking on Marcus's son as a fishing partner would mean accepting the obligation to teach him everything his father and I had learned, while keeping him safe in an occupation that had killed his father. I'd be honored to teach you, I said finally, but you'll have to promise me that you'll always put safety first. Your dad would never forgive me if something happened to you. As we tied up at the dock and unloaded our catch, I realized that the anniversary trip had accomplished something I hadn't anticipated. Instead of being a final test of whether I could continue fishing, it had become the beginning of a new partnership that would honor Marcus's memory while creating something new. That evening, Sarah Thompson came to the dock to see the salmon we'd caught and to hear about her son's first real fishing trip. "How did he do?" she asked, though she could see the answer in Marcus Jr.'s excitement about the day. "He's got his father's instincts," I replied. "If he wants to learn commercial fishing, I'll teach him everything Marcus and I knew." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was about more than just fishing. It was about passing on knowledge, maintaining connections, and ensuring that Marcus's influence would continue through his son. "Marcus would like that," she said. "He always said that the best thing about fishing was sharing it with people you cared about." 3 months later, Marcus Jr. joined me as a regular crew member on the North Star. Working with him was both painful and healing. Painful because he reminded me so much of his father, healing because he represented continuity and hope for the future. Teaching Marcus Jr. to fish forced me to articulate knowledge that his father and I had shared through wordless understanding. Every lesson became a way of keeping Marcus's memory alive while preparing his son for the challenges and rewards of commercial fishing. "Why do we check the engine oil before every trip?" I asked during one of our training sessions. "Because Dad always said that taking care of your equipment was the same as taking care of yourself," Marcus Jr. replied, quoting his father's philosophy word for word. The second fishing season with Marcus Jr. as crew was successful both financially and personally. We developed our own rhythm and communication style while building on the foundation that his father and I had established. It wasn't the same as my partnership with Marcus, but it was something valuable in its own right. 2 years after the sinking, I was able to talk about Marcus's death without being overwhelmed by guilt and trauma. The nightmares had become less frequent, the survivor's guilt had evolved into something more like gratitude for the years we'd shared, and my return to fishing felt like a tribute to his memory rather than a betrayal of his death. "Do you think Dad would be proud of how we're fishing?" Marcus Jr. asked during one of our trips. "I think he'd be proud of how you've learned the trade." Me would never replace what his father and I had shared, but it honored that relationship by continuing the tradition of skill, safety, and mutual respect that had characterized our 23 years of fishing together. Marcus Thompson had died when the Maria Elena sank, but his influence on commercial fishing lived on through his son and through everything he taught me about seamanship, fish behavior, and the bonds that develop between people who depend on each other in dangerous work. I'd watched my best friend sink with our boat, and there had been nothing I could do to save him. But I'd learned that honoring his memory meant more than just grieving his death. It meant continuing the work we'd both loved and passing on the knowledge we'd gained together. Sometimes survival isn't about escaping tragedy, it's about transforming it into something that preserves what was valuable about what you've lost. 5 years after I watched Marcus sink with the Maria Elena, I stood on the dock in Newport, Oregon, watching as Marcus Thompson Jr. prepared for his first trip as captain of his own fishing boat. At 23, he'd become everything his father had been: a skilled fisherman, a natural leader, and someone other fishermen trusted with their lives. "You ready for this?" I asked as he completed his pre-departure checklist on the Marcus Thompson, a 40-foot salmon trawler he'd purchased with money saved from 5 seasons of commercial fishing. "As ready as anyone can be," he replied, echoing the same mixture of confidence and humility that had characterized his father's approach to fishing. The boat was named for Marcus Sr., but the young captain had earned his position through years of learning every aspect of commercial fishing. He'd worked his way up from crew member to experienced fisherman to boat owner, following the same path his father and I had taken 25 years earlier. Watching him prepare for his first trip as captain brought back memories of my own early days as a fishing boat owner, when Marcus Sr. and I had bought our first boat and set out to build a commercial fishing operation. The excitement, the nervousness, the sense of embarking on something that would define the rest of our lives, it was all there in his son's preparations. "Remember what your dad always said about safety?" I told him as his crew finished loading supplies. "No fish is worth getting hurt over." "I remember," Marcus Jr. replied. "And I remember what you taught me about taking care of my crew. Dad's philosophy and your techniques. That's a pretty good combination." His crew consisted of 2 experienced fishermen and 1 newcomer, a young man about the same age Marcus Jr. had been when he'd first joined me on the North Star. The cycle of teaching and learning that had characterized commercial fishing for generations was continuing through another generation. "Take care of yourselves out there," I said as they prepared to cast off, "and bring back some fish." As I watched the Marcus Thompson disappear beyond the harbor entrance, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day when I'd lost my best friend and business partner. The guilt and trauma that had nearly driven me away from fishing had evolved into something more like acceptance of the risks and rewards that came with the work. My own fishing operation had evolved as well. I now owned 2 boats and employed 6 fishermen, including several young men who'd learned their trade working with Marcus Jr. and me. The business that Marcus Sr. and I had started with a single small boat had grown into something that supported multiple families and contributed to the local fishing community. But the most important change was personal. The survivor's guilt that had haunted me for years after the sinking had gradually transformed into something more like gratitude for the 23 years of partnership I'd shared with Marcus, for the knowledge and skills he'd helped me develop, and for the opportunity to pass that knowledge on to his son. Dr. Martinez, the therapist who'd helped me work through the trauma of losing Marcus, had predicted this evolution during one of our final sessions. Survivor's guilt often transforms into survivor's purpose, she'd explained. When you can't save the person you've lost, sometimes the healing comes from saving or teaching someone else. That prediction had proven accurate. Teaching Marcus Jr. to fish had been both a way of honoring his father's memory and a path toward healing my own psychological wounds. Every lesson had been a tribute to Marcus Sr., every successful trip a vindication of the partnership we'd built together. The fishing community had embraced Marcus Jr.'s advancement to boat owner with the same respect they'd shown his father. Commercial fishing was still a dangerous occupation that depended on skill, experience, and mutual support, and young captains who demonstrated those qualities were valued regardless of their family connections. "That boy's got his father's instincts and your teaching," Captain Jim Wilson had said when Marcus Jr. announced his plans to buy his own boat. "He's going to do well." The endorsement from a veteran fisherman like Jim carried weight in the fishing community. It meant that Marcus Jr. had earned his position through demonstrated competence rather than just family legacy. But success in commercial fishing was always provisional, always dependent on conditions beyond anyone's control. The same waters that had taken Marcus Sr.'s life continued to claim boats and fishermen, reminding everyone who worked there that experience and skill could reduce risks but never eliminate them entirely. 6 months after Marcus Jr. started running his own boat, the fishing community lost another vessel. The Pacific Dream went down in heavy seas with all 4 crew members aboard, including 2 men I'd known since they were teenagers learning to fish. Their deaths reminded me that the ocean was still looking for ways to kill fishermen, and that every trip carried the possibility of not coming home. "It never gets easier, does it?" Marcus Jr. asked when we attended the memorial service for the Pacific Dream's crew. "Losing people you've worked with, people you care about." "No," I replied honestly. "But that's part of what makes the work meaningful. When you depend on each other for survival, the relationships become more than just professional partnerships." The memorial service for the Pacific Dream was attended by hundreds of fishermen, family members, and community supporters who understood that commercial fishing was more than just a job. It was a way of life that created bonds between people who shared its risks and rewards. During the service, I thought about Marcus Sr. and the memorial we'd held for him 5 years earlier. The same mixture of grief and celebration, the same recognition of lives well lived in service to dangerous work, the same commitment to carrying on despite the losses. "Dad would have known those guys," Marcus Jr. said as we left the service. "He would have been here today paying his respects." "He is here," I replied. "Every time we teach someone to fish safely, every time we look out for each other on the water, every time we come home to our families, that's how we honor the people we've lost." The philosophy that had helped me survive Marcus Sr.'s death had become the foundation for how I approached both fishing and life. The partnerships we build, the knowledge we share, and the care we take for each other's safety. Those are the things that give meaning to dangerous work and create legacies that survive individual tragedies. 7 years after the sinking, I received an unexpected honor. The Oregon Commercial Fishing Association named me recipient of their annual Safety Award, recognizing my efforts to train new fishermen and promote safe fishing practices throughout the community. This award recognizes someone who has made commercial fishing safer for everyone, the association president said during the presentation ceremony. Dave Martinez has turned personal tragedy into community benefit, teaching dozens of young fishermen the skills and attitudes that keep people alive on the water. The award was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that Marcus Sr.'s influence on commercial fishing continued through the fishermen I trained and the safety practices we developed together. His death had been a tragedy, but it hadn't been meaningless. Marcus Jr. was in the audience for the award ceremony, now 25 years old and recognized as one of the most skilled young captains on the Oregon coast. Watching him listen to the presentation, I could see both his father's pride in good seamanship and his own satisfaction in being part of a community that valued safety and mutual support. "Dad would be proud," he said after the ceremony. "Not just of the award but of everything you've built since he died." 10 years after the sinking, I published a book about commercial fishing safety, dedicated to Marcus Thompson and the other fishermen who died pursuing the work they loved. The book combined technical information about boat maintenance and emergency procedures with stories about the human relationships that make dangerous work bearable. Fishing partnerships aren't just business relationships, I wrote in the introduction. They're bonds between people who trust each other with their lives. When those partnerships work, they create safety, success, and satisfaction that goes far beyond making money. When they're broken by tragedy, they leave wounds that can only be healed by honoring what was valuable about what's been lost. The book became required reading at several maritime academies and was used by fishing organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest to train new commercial fishermen. But for me, it was primarily a tribute to Marcus and an attempt to ensure that the knowledge we'd developed together would continue to benefit fishermen long after both of us were gone. I watched my best friend sink with the boat, and there was nothing I could do to save him. But I learned that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is not to be paralyzed by their death, but to be inspired by their life. Marcus Thompson died on September 14th, but his influence on commercial fishing continues through his son, through the fishermen I've trained, and through the safety practices that have become standard throughout the community. His partnership with me lasted 23 years, but its impact will last as long as people remember the importance of looking out for each other on dangerous waters. Sometimes tragedy creates legacy. Sometimes loss leads to purpose. Sometimes the best tribute to a friend's death is a lifetime spent trying to prevent others from experiencing the same loss. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Take care of each other, share what we know, and try to make sure that the people we care about make it home safely.